playing a lot of N64 games. A lot. And it's got me thinking, what are the top 10 bosses on the N64? So, I made a list. You're welcome. Keep in mind, I haven't played all of the N64 games, but I have played most of the big ones. And before anyone can comment, what? No blank? No. No blank. Deal with it. It's my list. So originally, when I was making this list, I promised myself that the Great Mighty Poo was not going to make it on here. I kept telling myself that he's just not a good enough boss, but I caved. While I still believe that from a design standpoint, the Great Mighty Poo isn't great, he's still easily one of the most memorable bosses from the N64. His fight isn't bad altogether, but the atmosphere and the wonderful song that he sings make him an absolute must-have experience on the N64. I know that this one seems a little bit predictable. I mean, everyone is familiar with this boss fight, and when we think about it now, it may not feel like it's great, but let's think about a few things here. One reason why people don't like this fight as much is because of the repetition. You have to fight Bowser 3 times, and the mechanics are basically the same all 3 times, except for the third, which is just 3 times the work. But how many boss fights currently rely on simply using the joystick, and how many boss fights up to this point had something this inventive? Nintendo made one of the craziest design controllers that we've ever seen, and they said, yeah, let's do some awesome stuff with this. And the Bowser boss fight is the result of that exact quote. Whereas the first 2 bosses were on the list because of how iconic they are, this one is probably unknown by most people. Ogre Battle 64, Person of Lordly Caliber, has a lot of forgettable boss fights. Everything is pretty easy, and as you're playing, you feel like it's going to be an easy game to breeze through. Well, the final boss fight, Danika, flips that on its head. To start off with, it's one of the most visually stunning boss fights in the game, it's easily the hardest, and the fact that once you start the battle with her, the entire stage warps, making the stakes feel more important. It's the perfect ending to a great game. The bosses in Ocarina of Time are, from a design standpoint, repetitive. It's often use the weapon that you got in the temple, then whack it with your sword. This is decent design overall, but like I said, it gets repetitive. It's when Ocarina of Time puts a spin on this that I think it produces its best boss fights, and easily one of the best boss fights is Phantom Ganon. It starts off with one of the better gimmicks in the game, with Phantom Ganon jumping from painting to painting. What's nice is that it's not shooting him with your bow and arrow, then slicing him with your sword, and it later on introduces a mechanic that comes in handy with Ganondorf's boss fight, tennis. Oh yeah! As some of you may know, I've already stated that the Skidar King from Perfect Dark is one of the best Rareware bosses I've ever fought, specifically on the N64. It's not too much to handle, and you beat it with some innovative ways that don't even involve actually killing the boss yourself, but bringing in the stage, which is something that I've always thought was inventive. This is also an action-packed boss fight where you are always moving, and in many ways, in contrast to other Rareware bosses, you're in control of the fight. It's not sitting around and waiting for the boss to allow you to attack, but you have to take the initiative yourself to make it happen, and that's something that most of Rareware's final bosses lack. One thing that I really like in my boss fights is knowing how well you're doing. A health bar helps, but when a boss fight can do it in many other ways, that's cool. My example is Huff'n'Puff. Out of all the bosses in Paper Mario, this one takes the cake. It's nice to see him physically wear out, which is something that's pretty unique in general. As the battle progresses, you see him get smaller and the energy get knocked out of him. Literally. That, combined with how fantastic the battle system is in Paper Mario, makes for one great boss battle. This is the kind of boss fight that just feels right. It's one of the best ways to conclude a game. The setting, the simple mechanics, the music, it all blends so well to give us one of the most interesting boss fights on the Nintendo 64. It took that traditional style of Kirby boss fights and stuck it in 3D, and the transition worked just fine. The only real downside to this boss fight is that some of its attacks are hard to see, but that could just be that I suck. Donkey Kong 64 has some pretty solid boss fights, but not all of them feel great. However, there is one boss fight in particular that I think is absolutely fantastic, Mad Jack. It's not too hard, it's not too easy, but it does a great job at keeping you busy. This is the kind of boss fight that makes great use of the player character. In Donkey Kong 64, there are 5 available characters to play as, and each character gets a boss fight, but they easily use Tiny Kong's ability the best within her fight. It's all about the platforming, and there's no better Kong to do this than Tiny Kong. Well, there's Dixie. I like bosses with multiple ways to win, and even though there are technically only 2 options, the Forever Train in Star Fox 64 does it the best. A lot of the boss fights in Star Fox 64 are great, but they're virtually the same. It's just shooting at an enemy whenever they give you a chance. You can take this route whenever you fight the Forever Train and just lay into it, but instead, you can take sort of a passive route and shoot a few switches, which will send the train crashing into a fiery death. You know, the passive route. And before I get to my number 1, let's look at some honorable mentions. Twinrova is an amazing boss fight. I don't feel that there's an intro that I could really write to exemplify that, so we're cutting straight to it. Like mentioned before, Ocarina's boss fights are repetitive, and you can even argue that this fight falls under those repetitive fights, but I don't necessarily agree. It actually introduces its own mechanic to the fight, which makes it super distinct from any other part of the game. Up to this point, the mirror shield was used to reflect light, but once this boss fight is in session, the mirror shield can then absorb attacks. Figuring out this fight is a puzzle in itself, and with it also containing its own little story, it has become one of the most memorable boss fights on the N64. And there it was, my top 10 N64 bosses. Did you agree with my list? Probably not, but you know what? That's okay. Thanks for taking your time to watch my video. Go ahead and leave in the comments your favorite N64 bosses and tell me how wrong I am. Let's get the discussion going. Until next time, thanks for watching.